good nuggets to part 2 of making the very first boss fight. And if you haven't seen part 1, make sure to check out that video before you watch this one. It's somewhere in one of these corners. Alright, where in part 1 we focused on making all the parts and putting together a great fight, in today's video I want to look at how I brought it all together, and specifically at how I'm using Unity's timeline to do so. And really stick around until the end of this video, because at the end I have a very important question for you, you, about this whole boss fight. Like I said at the end of part 1, you can't just place a boss at the end of a level and call it a boss fight. At least, I don't think so. I think a boss needs at the very least an introduction at the start of the level, just so you know who you're up against. Otherwise, it wouldn't really be a boss, it would just be a very strong enemy. At least, that's how I think about it. And so, that's just what I did. I made an introduction. In this very short cutscene, you get introduced to Laser Guy. He drops a little story and a few hints, and he gives a very good reason why the whole place is filled with moving lasers. A fairly simple yet elegant solution, if I say so myself, and also do take note of how you respond to his question. After the introduction, you make your way through the level, and of course you will run into him again at the end. And if you do, you get this introduction to the boss fight. See what I did there? A nod back to the answer you gave all the way back in the introduction. And then of course, at the end, after you defeat Laser Guy, you get this ending cutscene, which I already spoiled a bit in the previous devlog. However, I changed one big thing. Collecting bigger parts was giving me some trouble here and there, so for now, and remember the creative process, I removed collecting bigger parts from the game. And as a player, you just have to collect as much material as possible. So I made the big bots bleed bolts. Try saying that 20 times fast. Now, I feel adding these cutscenes and story elements really brought together the level. And if I'm completely honest, after I was done making all this, it actually felt like a real game and it looked much more professional than it did in the beginning. But now, of course, the question why you're here, how did I do it? Mostly using Unity's timeline. I'm a big fan of Unity's timeline. Timeline basically is a sequencer or a tool that allows you to visually edit audio, play animations, toggle objects, control particles, and much more, all on a timeline. Now, I won't go into great detail about Unity's timeline because that's way out of scope for this video, but here's a quick overview. You create a new timeline by creating a timeline asset on any game object. And you can then drag in game objects you wish to control into your timeline. Whenever you drag a game object into your timeline, you can choose between a number of different track types, depending on the components on that object. Different track types allow you to control different aspects of that object. For instance, an animation track will let you change animations, and an audio track will let you play audio clips. Once you've chosen the correct track, you can start placing clips. Here, for instance, I want Carly to play an animation as soon as the timeline starts, and so I place an animation clip at the start. And when the timeline plays, Carly will start dancing. Now that you know the basics of Unity Timeline, let's take a closer look at how I used it all to create the cutscenes. But before we do, if you like this video, please leave a like, and if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, you might just do that as well, as it really helps the channel out and help me make Wrench the best game possible. And also, if you would like to chat after hours, we have a Discord server, which is linked in the description down below. This big collider triggers the first part of the cutscene and starts the first timeline as soon as you enter it. One of the big perks of using Timeline is that you can use it to control your cameras. So right out of the gate, as the timeline starts, I switch cameras and you see Laser Guy appear. Then I switch back to Carly and then back to an overview. Something that also happens simultaneously is that Carly is teleported to a set location. And because this is something I need to do a lot, I made my own timeline track specifically to do this. How I did this is really out of scope for this video, but know that if you're planning on using Timeline as much as I do, that it's a great trick to have in your tool belt to be able to make your own tracks. And whenever I need to make my own playable or track, I always reference this great article by Ciro Constanicio, and I've linked it in the description for you to check out. Then you might have noticed these white markers. These are signals. Signals or events is something that's found in other Unity features like Unity's regular animation timeline, but they are very powerful. In short, when you add a game object to your timeline, you can pick a signal track. This will then create a signal receiver component on your object, which can receive signals from the timeline. You can then create signals and place them in your timeline. First, we create a new signal emitter and tell Unity what signal to emit. You can create new ones, but I already made this test signal. Now, in the signal receiver on your object, you can tell Unity what to do when this object receives the chosen signal. Here, for instance, I simply turn the game object off, but I use this all the time to lock controls, or like in the first timeline, start a dialogue. In this case though, as soon as the timeline hits the signal, it sends a message to the game object and simply hides it. At the end of the first timeline, I use a signal to start a dialogue, and then we're in a regular dialogue as we would be in any other place of the game. But at the end of that dialogue, I start a new timeline. Yo dog, I heard you like timelines, so I put a timeline in your timeline so you can timeline while you timeline. At the end of the dialogue though, I start a new timeline which will end the first encounter. This next timeline uses a lot of activation tracks which can activate or deactivate objects. I use those a lot to play particle effects which have the play on awake option on. Or in this case, I use it to activate the drop crates and afterwards the dishes and the moving lasers. By now you might have spotted my material swapper track, which is a track that swaps materials. I use it a lot to swap Carly's face, or in this instance the face of Laser Guy. Just remember that by creating your own tracks you can do so many powerful things. It really is a beautiful tool. So let me leave you with one more trick that I do a lot in the cutscenes, and that's swapping out game objects which persist after the timeline is done playing. I do this, for example, at the end where I swap the just animated model of Laser Guy with a destructible one which can give you your material. That way, I never get one game object with too many different behaviors. Again, Timeline has so much more depth and options and features that I really urge you to look into it and check out some tutorials. Or just play around and find out. There you have it, Nuggets, the very first boss fight from first encounter until last explosion. And as per usual, a lot of things like audio, animations and effects will need to be tweaked, but I think this is a great start. Except for one thing. I've been referring to this boss by its codename Laser Guy, and that name, obviously unlike him, is not going to fly. And that's why I want to ask you what you would call this boss. Leave a comment down below with your name and I will pick one of the names to be in the game. In any case, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.